Great. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about a range of things that we are doing and we've been doing in Wollongong. So I'm going to talk about the range of stuff that we're doing, and then at the end I'm going to have a bit of a rant about my 2 cents on where the Australian geoscience community is today, and where personally I believe we should go if we want to survive and prepare for the future. And really, actually, that talk should be called, when you're a middle-aged white male, you just present your students' work. Because that's pretty much what it is. What I'm going to be talking about today in terms of science that's been produced, largely by students and postdocs that have been working in the lab here in Wollongong. So kudos and credit to them. So in terms of science, we're going to cover a wide range of topics. No idea how long that's going to take. So I hope that, like me, you got a glass of wine and you're ready to buckle up for the adventure. And we're going to go from as far as 600 million years ago, which might not be that far from some of the geologists present, and as early as, well, last year, bushfire, basically, and also things that touch us directly. So application also to biomedical research. So the first 4 topics, they are geoscience, when you talk about Precambrian environments, when you talk about paleontology, when you talk about soil and water resources and fire regime on soil and water resources, all that is geoscience. The one about chronic kidney disease, I will acknowledge that it's a little bit far-field for a GSA presentation, but still I hope you'll enjoy it. So first we're gonna go about 600 million years ago, and one question I'm interested in is when things, in terms of evolution of life, when things did start to get complex. Life is actually pretty basic for most of evolution. For several billion years, life is actually very simple. And most of the tree of life is already represented, but it's fairly simple. So what happens in terms of environment, and we're talking at that stage, of course, life is still in the oceans. So what happened in the oceans that we changed the recipe of the soup to get complex life. And then so we are there, so animals, let me put something like that. So we finally do that last branch of the tree of life, which is very different than the rest of evolution and much more complex. And we see that also in terms of biodiversity. You see the diversity of assemblage of fossils really takes off at about 600 million years ago. So that's mostly the work of Holly, one of my PhD students who just submitted. That's her in the field, helping with carrying wood and holding a can of beer in her mouth too. And she just has taken a job at Geoscience Australia. So congratulations to her. It's great to hear that she got a position. And of course, there's a whole bunch of people involved in this project. So so what happens in evolution such that we start making animals, we start making intelligent life forms, such as cats, who apparently are able to grate their own cheese in their pasta. Very well trained cats. Well, that time of Earth's history is actually quite interesting in terms of environmental change. We at a time in Earth's history where there are some very dramatic change in the environment. Episode that we call Snow Earth, because we think that the entire planet was covered in ice. So imagine a little bit something like a scene from The Empire Strikes Back without the Imperial war machines, or maybe they were there, but there's no fossil of Imperial war machines as far as I know. So there are episodes of Earth's history where the planet is covered in ice, which is likely to have had an influence, of course, on the chemistry of the ocean. So do we have an increase in nutrient supply to the oceans in the wake of deglaciation that followed this Snowball Earth episode? Because of course, that pause in nutrient supply could really help understand why you have this major leap in evolution. So we turn to carbonate rocks. Carbonate rocks are archive of ancient seawater composition. And Australia is very lucky with the sort of geological record we have, because we have some of these rocks that record. So the Ediacaran start with carbonate rocks that record the wake of the deglaciation, the Marianas, the last major deglaciation, and you have actually the Golden Spike right there in the Flinders Range in South Australia. And of course, being a good mama's boy, I took my mom there, and she very much enjoyed that, I believe. So these carbonate rocks in the Flinders, and you find them across the world too, they're really important because they tell us what changed in the chemistry in the wake of this deglaciation, which also happened just before the first evidence of animal fossils in the geological record. And when you go down to the Flinders, so it's beautiful going through Parachinla Gorge, because you have, as you drive through the gorge, you can see, you can travel through time, go through the Cryogenian, so the time of this glaciation, through the Ediacaran. If you're lucky, you will see, if you know where to look, you will see a fossil or two. And then at the end of the gorge, you get into the Cambrian, and it is an explosion of life. You can see fossils all around you in the rock. So I told students, aren't you excited? There's millions of fossils in these rocks. That took a little bit of nudging them, but I managed to get some excitement out of these guys. Okay, so how did nutrient supply change in the wake of deglaciation? What changed in the recipe of the soup? So nutrients are supplied to the ocean by rivers. So we want to understand what's changing in the chemistry of rivers. These nutrients in the rivers, they're derived from the dissolution of minerals in rocks and soil, what we call silicate weathering. And clays that you find in soil and that you need to grow your plants are the residue of silicate weathering. So the formation of clay is going to tell us something interesting about what's happening in terms of nutrient supply to the ocean. So how can the chemistry of those neoproterozoic carbonate rocks can tell us about the change in nutrient supply at that time in Earth's history? So to do that, we look at lithium isotope. Lithium isotope, measuring that in the carbonate rock, is going to tell us about something that's happening to on the continents. So the rocks, any type of rocks, actually have quite a narrow range of lithium isotope composition. So if you take a rock, or not this rock, okay, that joke is always a fail. And generally, it's much better here because I can't see most of you, so I can't see you not laugh at that joke. So I think I like these online things. Okay, if you take a rock, so maybe not that rock, but maybe this rock, they will have pretty much the same lithium isotope composition. Then you start, so you have meteoric waters, you start weathering that rock, you start dissolving the minerals. And when you do that, you will create clays. So what happens to the lithium isotope? Lithium-6 likes to be in the clays. Lithium-7 will prefer to be in the water. So you have something we call isotope fractionation. So that means that depending how much of those clays you form, so the sort of weathering regime, how much mineral dissolution, how much nutrient supply, you will end up with a different lithium isotope composition in the river. So the lithium isotope composition of the river is going to tell us about what's happening on the continent in terms of weathering, thus in terms of nutrient supply. The seawater, the lithium isotope composition of the seawater respond to whatever you put in it, and a lot of the lithium is coming from the rivers. So if we can look at the lithium isotope composition of the seawater in the past, that can tell us about the lithium isotope composition of the rivers, which can tell us about environments on the continents. And those carbonates, again, they record the composition of seawater. So the lithium isotope of the carbonate can tell us about the past seawater, which can tell us about the past rivers and the past continental environments. So what do we find? So that's where I'm using tricks to protect, unpublished data. So you don't need to do anything to your monitor if you see a graph that's a little bit blurry. This is not a Twilight Zone episode. There's nothing wrong with your monitor. I just blurred images just to protect, because that's going to end up on YouTube. I'm not worried about the people here right now, but just to protect the data from the PhD student. So we measure lithium isotope composition in sections from Australia, that's the blue dots, and also from China. Again, you can find these rocks across the world. And then we combine that, we account for datagenesis, which is much more complicated than it sounds. And we combine that with ocean box model to try to infer some information about what's happening to the rivers that feed in the ocean at that time. So again, 600 million years ago. That box model, simpler than it looks, it's just looking what do you need to change in the input of lithium, so that's the rivers, that's the hydrothermal vent, and output, so the lithium sucked out from the seawater into the sediment at the bottom of the ocean to get what you measure in the seawater. And what we find, so to reproduce these blue dots, to reproduce what we measure in the carbonate rocks, so that black curve, that's the model, we need a few things that are quite mind-boggling about what happened back then. We need very large flux of lithium from the rivers. We're talking 10 to 100 times more lithium that is delivered right now by rivers into the ocean. And for the whole duration of carbonate deposition. So there's a bit of debate about duration, but we're talking probably 2 to 4 million years. So for several million years, there's a shitload, excuse my French, lithium and other nutrients that are delivered to the ocean. Mind-boggling. Get used to that one. Then what we learn also from modeling this carbonate data is that the lithium isotope composition of the rivers is really low. So we're talking -5 to 0 per mil, which is probably to most of you, that's not going to be telling you anything. What it tells you is that first, we haven't measured that in any rivers today. In the modern world, there's no river that has something that low. Something that low means that you making crap load of clays, you doing a lot of mineral dissolution and leave a lot of clay as a residue. So you go basically to keep using the Star Wars reference, you go from Hoth, you go to from the Empire Strikes Back, the Ice Planet to Yavin. So, well, except that at that time there was no tree, but think, really thick, clay-rich soils. So very drastic change in environment. Mind-boggling again and again and again. So we start to get an idea of what's happening at that time after deglaciation. And there's one more. Okay, that's probably enough. Now, let's take that a step further. So we learn a little bit about what might have happened to the ocean. Well, and being again a good mama's boy, I'm going to give credit to my mom who drew my attention to that paper. So in that paper in PNAS, they look at body size measurement from historical and fossil records. So basically, they look at the dimension of all sorts of living organisms, past and present. What they find is that you do, of course, get change in evolution on short time scale. Okay, we see that. We see the disappearance, the emergence of new species, but these short bursts in evolution, they don't accumulate. What that means is that you don't make major shift in evolution. You're not going to create through this short-term change in evolution, you're not going to make a new branch of the tree of life that I showed at the beginning. For that, what they found is that if the time scale of change is greater than 1 million years, you increase divergence. What that means is that you start making really long-lasting, profound change to the tree of life. So maybe the key, what we see in those ediacaran carbonate is that we have a massive nutrient delivery for a long time, for more than 1 million years, for 2 to 4 million years. So maybe that was the key to evolution. Maybe that's sustained. So it's not just about a burst of nutrient supply at the end of the glaciation, but a sustained massive load of nutrient supply for several million years. That was the key to evolution and to make complex life like animals, which is right after we start seeing in the fossil record. Mind-boggling, right? I hope that explodes your mind as it explodes mine. Okay, so let's take a big leap in Earth's history. Let's leave behind Precambrian. Let's come into, well, tertiary, but we're going to focus mostly on the quaternary, and we're really going to focus just on the last 100,000 of years. So megafauna, we had until 40,000, maybe later, we had really large marsupials in Australia. We still have some, like the red kangaroo. Technically, they would actually still qualify as megafauna. But we had really large cousins to the wombat, really large birds like genionis, really large short-faced kangaroo, and so on. All these guys, all these critters, they are vanished today. A lot of people are debating about what happened, why did they die. Personally, I'm interested in understanding how they lived. Because also, if you want to understand how they died, you can't go around without knowing how they lived. So that's the topic of Daphne here, who's finishing her PhD. There's also an honor student working on that this year, and there's a whole bunch of undergrad students that have helped with this project too. So how do we go about that? We look, so again, we use isotopes. This time we look at calcium isotope. So 44 calcium, 42 calcium. And we measure that in tooth enamel. So you can get access, if you're really nice, to collection from museum with fossils where they let you sample. You only need a few milligrams of enamel to do your calcium isotope measurement. And I can see Daphne is connected, so she'll be able to correct me if I say anything wrong. And one thing that inspired us to do this in Australia was that paper that came out a couple of years ago, where they look at, in Kenya, at African fauna. And you have your rhino here, giraffe, elephants, bovids, big cows, zebra and other horses, pigs, big cats, hippo, hyena. What you see is that as you go up the trophic chain, that calcium isotope ratio in the tooth enamel is going down. So there's the potential of using that tool to have an understanding in the past. So they've done that for the modern fauna to get some sort of baseline of what the trophic level should look like when you look at calcium isotope. So then you can apply that to fossil taxa, where you have a much less of a good idea of who was eating what and who. And just to make sure we're all on board, I gave a similar seminar in Wollongong, and one of my colleagues afterwards say, "Oh, you're talking about browsers? I thought you were talking about internet browser. I didn't realize they were browser as type of animals." So just to make sure, and it's a fair comment, grazers, we're generally talking things like sheep, like things that will eat mostly grass and so on. Browser, a good example, bit of an extreme example, is the giraffe. So we're talking something that's going to eat leaves, branch, and things like that. And with calcium isotope, there's also the opportunity, you can look at carnivores, what sort of herbivores they would eat, and also within the herbivores, looking at what sort of diet did they have. The reason why you can use calcium isotope is because depending whether the vegetation that is eaten is dicot or monocot. So dicot in Australia, you can think about the gum tree. Monocot, you can think about the spinifex, so more like grass again. So depending what different type of vegetation, dicot and monocot will have different calcium isotope composition. That's why then that ends up in the herbivores, and that gives them different calcium isotope composition. So Daphne started doing that. We needed a baseline. We only have data pretty much just from Kenya, mostly placental mammals. In Australia, that's actually the only place in the world where you have all three kinds of mammals. So because we're focusing, for megafauna, we're focusing on marsupials, we really want to establish this baseline. What do we know? How does the picture of marsupial trophic system looks like today? So then we can go in the past. So you got to start somewhere. So Daphne started with wombats in Tasmania, building up on a previous study by Georgia Roberts in Melbourne, where she looked at carbon and oxygen isotope in teeth. So she collected teeth from wombats around, mostly by collecting roadkills, unfortunately, for the wombat, but fortunately for us, because that gives us access to easy samples. And one of the things she found, so you get this grazing wombat. It's very distracting because it's really cute. So this is the data in a nutshell that Daphne obtained for the modern wombat, basically giving us a pinpoint of what the modern wombat will look like in the marsupial ecosystem. And that's just plotted against, so I'm showing the graph without blurring it because she's about to submit revisions. So hopefully that'll be published soon, which is great news. So that's put against existing data on placentals. But again, these are the first data on marsupials. So it's interesting because here you can see that the modern wombat actually compared to mixed feeders or even browser placentals. But we know, of course, we're looking at modern animals, we know that wombats are grazer. That looks pretty much something like this. But they can also have a varied diet, which includes roots and barks, which might explain why, in terms of calcium isotope composition, it's a little higher, a little closer to the browser than we were expecting. Or maybe there could be also differences in physiology between placental and marsupial mammals. So again, justifying the need to establish this baseline for marsupials. Another interesting results, I'm not going to show everything from our paper, but another interesting result is the lack of statistical significant difference between male and females, which is good because we don't want sex to be confounding the effect of different diet on the calcium isotope composition of tooth enamel. Another interesting thing that she's been doing is looking to sampling along the tooth, because these teeth, they grow, so they record times, they record the life of the individual. So you can potentially, if you look along the teeth, you can potentially learn things that happen during the life of the individual. And previously that was shown that carbon and oxygen isotope vary throughout the life of the individual. And for carbon isotope, that's telling you whether you're looking at C3 plants. Sometimes the wombat was eating a bit more C3 plants. Sometimes it was eating a little bit more of C4 grasses. So depending on resource availability, most likely, you have evolution, you have a change in the diet. What's interesting, that seems in some cases, that seems to correlate with the change in calcium isotope, where we do see when the wombat was eating more C4 grasses, we have more of a grazer signal from calcium isotope. So the two isotopic system agree, which is interesting because that application of calcium isotope is very novel. So we still need to do these sort of validations. So then we can start looking at fossils and start looking at extinct megafauna marsupials. So that's something, so Daphne is writing up at the moment, and we've been focusing on two sites in northwestern New South Wales, Wellington Cave, which is the site where the first megafauna fossil were found, and Bingara, which is a little bit north of Wellington. So what you find is I blurred this graph because it's going to be a bit of time before it's published. So we're just protecting the data from trolls on YouTube. So one of the interesting results is that the diprotodon, which is a long gone cousin of wombats and also koalas, seem to have a similar diet to the modern wombat. So those blurry dots, that's your modern wombat. And those blurry dots here, that's the data we have for diprotodon. But we're looking at very different animals. The diprotodon was estimated to be about 2 meters tall, 3 meters long, and weigh up to 3 tons. Quite different from the little cute wombat. Mind-boggling, because it's a little bit like, you know, you can imagine a lion hunting and eating a zebra. I don't imagine my cat doing that. This cat looks like it's ready for dinner, but I don't think zebra would be on the menu for that cat. So quite interesting that very different related fauna, but with obvious very different features, could have had the same diet. Then you also have extant fauna in the fossil record. So fauna that still exists around here, like your macropus, your kangaroo, and your petrogel, so your rock wallaby. What's interesting is that for the fossil macropus and petrogel, we see very similar calcium isotope composition, again suggesting that these two taxa will have a similar diet. That's quite different than what we know today. Your kangaroo today is going to be mostly grazing. Your rock wallaby got a bit more of a mixed diet. There's some browsing going on. There's also a bit of grazing. So maybe further back in time, pending resource availability, the diet of these animals shifted through time. So that's, you know, we're just opening the Pandora's box, basically, of what we can learn about these animals, extinct, but also extant, how their diet varied through time. And then you can also look, so we also have data from the Procoptodon, so the short-faced kangaroo, which was probably about 2 meters tall, 200 kilos, so that's some big kangaroo. We're looking at quite high calcium isotope value. So perhaps a more specialized browser diet. Yeah, it is beefy roots. Sabine got that right. Equally beefy, the protemnodon, so the giant wallaby. Again, we're talking about 170 kilos. Very different. You could expect the morphology of this animal, protemnodon and procoptodon, is actually not, there's obviously some differences, but in the words of Sabine, we're looking at very beefy marsupials. So they could have similar diet. What we see here is that actually the protemnodon might have been a more specialized grazer diet. So especially compared to its extant wallaby cousin. And then there's got to be blurry, some just very exciting stuff where if you look at different type of teeth, molar 1, premolar, molar 3, and so on, these teeth, they erupt at different times. So they also tell you, looking at different teeth, you can look at the history of the individual, including when you look at teeth that erupt early, that can tell you for how long that animal was breastfeeding. Breastfeeding, knowing this sort of duration of breastfeeding is important because that tells you about the reproductive cycle of this animal, which is important also to understand their survival. The longer it takes for an animal to produce offsprings, the more it's going to be vulnerable to extinction, which is one of the hypotheses for megafauna extinction in Australia. And we start collecting some data that could inform us on for the duration of breastfeeding of this now extinct fauna. I find that pretty cool. All right, I reckon we talk about a lot about marsupials. So I figure we should watch a video. I don't know if you're gonna hear that, but it's subtitles anyway.
What's up, Skip? Hey. You all right? Kangaroos.
All right, so for those who are connecting from overseas, that's typically what happens in Australia. You can get attacked by a kangaroo. We actually right there with Sean and Rebecca who are with us right now. So that's near Canberra. We've been in the field out there. That's the old station where they have the radio telescope, one of the station where they have the radio telescope tracking the satellites and tracking when Apollo went to the moon. So quite interesting historically. And right now that I totally get what happens in that video because it's filled with kangaroos. I've never seen so many kangaroos. They totally took over the radio telescope station. Okay, let's go back to science. Yeah, so there's also another application. So you can look at Quaternary Pleistocene fauna, but you can go much further back in time. I don't know if that video is familiar to anyone. That's from a movie. You don't win anything if you get this right. That's from Jurassic Park. That's when the T-Rex shows up. So yes, you can apply also calciumized stuff to dinosaurs. And that's what we hope we'll start doing with a colleague at the University of New England, where we could learn a lot, hopefully, about the diet of ancient, extinct, of course, dinosaur, which is really interesting for this kind of fauna, because that's not something you can easily do with carbonized stuff. Carbonized stuff are really useful to learn about diet, but it's more reliable when it's done in collagen, which degrades with time and of course wouldn't be as available if you go back 100 million years ago. All right, enough with T-Rex. Another interesting application, you can look at soon extinct animals, so us. So you can do some paleoanthropology and trying to understand how some of our past cousins, like Australopithecine, use to raise their kids. So that study that we published last year or a couple of years ago. And when we look at a range of things, but including strontium isotope, which tells you how the individual moved around the landscape during its life, and trace element. And what we learn is that, well, these people, the strontium isotope told us that these people, they used to live in what is now Lesotho, and they weren't moving, it's really high plateau. They weren't moving around too much. And what we find a lot of stress, what we call stress lining teeth. So also as a geologist, you can end up becoming a dentist. We find stress line that tells us that there was return sometimes to breastfeeding. So because they weren't moving around much in the landscape, there was a return to breastfeeding for the kids of Australopithecine. It's a great success. Thanks, Bharat. So then, going back, coming to something that really affects us pretty much every time there's a flood, we can look at landscape evolution and the soil and river response to climate change. So why is that important? Well, soil erosion does respond to climate variability. We do know that if you turn up the rainfall, you're going to turn up the erosion. But we need to learn a lot more about what happens in terms of the relationship between soil erosion and climate, because that impacts water quality when you dump a lot of sediment in the water, and that also affects urban planning, of course. So there's another set of isotope we can use for that, uranium isotope in sediment this time. They can tell us about how much time the sediment has spent in the basin, in the river catchment. If you apply that to sediment deposit, like in lakes, like in oceans, that could tell you about the links between climate and landscape evolution and change in erosion and sediment supply. So that's the work of Maud, who's just, she submitted her PhD earlier at the end of 2020. And so another graduate, congrats to her. So she worked on that in the Var River catchment. I grew up actually not far from there, just outside the map. So that river drains a good part of the French Alps and then dumps sediments into the Mediterranean. So we can learn things about sediment dynamics and also go back in the past, looking at the deposit in the sediment in the Mediterranean. So one thing she did, looking at the sediment in the river catchment, looking at sediment from different rivers in the catchment, for the individual rivers, we can calculate what is the sediment residence time, how much time the sediment is spending in the catchment. And what we tested for the first time is that, what do we calculate? Does what we calculate with uranium isotope make sense? So she was able to use mean soil thickness that you can get from spatial data, combine that with denudation rate that you can get from cosmogenic isotope in sediment, and that gives you an independent estimate of the sediment residence time. And what she found, what you can barely see in that blurry diagram, again, because it's not published yet, is that you have a very good relationship between those independent estimates and what we get from uranium isotope. So really, thanks to her, because I've been doing uranium isotope for over 20 years, and that was the first time someone was actually able to show that, well, this uranium isotope business actually might make sense. So then going to sediment records, so this gray, blurry, wiggly line, that's oxygen isotope, that tells you about climate, and those blurry triangles, that tells you, that's the uranium isotope that tells you about erosion. What we see, for instance, is that at the end of the last glacial maximum, the sediment's residence time increased twofold. So not only sediment supply decreased after 18,000 years, so when you start doing deglaciation, But those sediments, they're not coming from the same place in the catchment. That looks like that increasing residence time in telling us we're not getting sediment from the Alps anymore. So those periglacial processes, like freeze-thaw that you have in mountains that produce a lot of sediment, they're not delivering to the river. The sediment is coming from other parts of the catchment. So we knew before that, again, you turn up rainfall, that will turn up erosion. What we're learning here is that that's also going to change where you're eroding in the catchment, which is really important to understand how rivers will respond to future climate change. What we also see, we have this thing called DO, Densgaard-Oeschger events, so really quick, very rapid climate fluctuation about 40,000 years ago. Interesting for us because the rate of climate change back then was similar to what we're experiencing now. What we see is that those triangles, they just follow these variations. So the erosion is responding right away to very rapid climate variation. So that hopefully that can help us understand a bit better our rivers and hopefully planning so this sort of thing don't happen so much anymore. Sabine, how am I doing with time?
You're good. Keep going, Tony. We're loving it.
Yeah. Chime in if I'm boring people too much. So you can apply, I'll go quick on this one. You can apply that to late sediment too, and we did that in the Balkan area, and we learned things. So here that was just looking at the past 15,000 years. What we find, oh, thanks, Joanna. What we found was really interesting is that until about 8,000 years ago, erosion was really responding in sync with climate variation, a little bit like I showed earlier for the Mediterranean Sea. What happens after 8,000 years ago is that erosion doesn't care anymore, whether it's dry or wet, it's doing the same thing. And we link that to vegetation cover. After 8,000 years ago, a lot of the tree cover is gone. And as a result, the sensitivity of erosion to climate has completely been transformed. So of course, we know that trees are helping to prevent erosion. What we learned from this study is that it's also changing the sensitivity of erosion and then rivers to climate change. So yeah, so that was the work of Alex Franke, was postdoc here, and who's got now a new position at University of Adelaide. So well done, bro. Chuck Norris approves. Well done for that work. All right, next, moving on to bushfires. We can also do things with isotopes to understand bushfires. So we're trying to develop new tools to understand past fire regime, so we can understand in the future how these fires will respond to climate variability. So that's the work of Sean, who's here with us tonight, studying on a master, transfer to a PhD, that's great. Rebecca too, who's, yep, she's with us too tonight. She started as an undergrad in the lab, did honors, and now that greatly she's doing a PhD. And there's, of course, a whole bunch of people associated with that work. So the idea is to use, because boron is heavily cycled to vegetation, the idea is to test whether boron isotope, whether boron, let me try to wine. I'm sure that works better with wine. Okay. The idea is to test whether, see, the rosé absolutely work. You can trust French rosé. To test whether boron isotope could tell us something about fire regime. Is it responding to fire regime? So that's actually a discovery grant we got from the ARC. So yeah, it's good to get a little bit of money sometimes to do our research. We're grateful for that. So we start doing that. So Sean started looking at soils that have recorded 2 fire seasons back in the 90s and earlier in the 2000s. So you had sites where there was a high severity fire followed by another high severity fire. So high severity means you're burning all the way to the crown of the tree. Then you have sites that low fire, low fire followed by high severity fire, so LH, and so on. So low fire severity, not burning as high onto the tree. And what we found, again, blurry diagram because it's unpublished data, we find that as soon as a site soil experiences one high severity fire, you have a shift, so higher boron isotope value in the soil. We see that quite well in the topsoil. It's a little bit less obvious deeper in the soil, but that makes sense because you lose that signal pretty quickly. The heat actually itself is absorbed, is decreasing very quickly in the soil. So there's good hope with this data that we might have a tool that's going to tell us about fire severity. So the next idea, and that's what Rebecca is doing, is to look at sediment. So then in the sediment, how is this recording past fire? By doing that, hopefully, and we're looking at also combining that with other isotopes, we could perhaps have a record of past fire, and going perhaps 100 years, you could go even longer, and identify when back in time you had high severity fires. Link that with climatic record, and then go forward and look how climate forecasting models could then predict change in fire regime. So it's very exciting being able to learn about future change of fire regime. And then last part, so now, okay, all this so far, it is geoscience, believe it or not. Now it's getting a bit more far-field. So I'm going to briefly talk about chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease, I wasn't aware of that before I started working on this. That affects a lot of people. We're talking about 500 million people worldwide. It's actually on average 10% of the population have some form of kidney disease. For indigenous Australian, it's actually closer to 20%. For people living in Wollongong, around the Wollongong area, it's also close to 20%. So that's actually a quite important pathology that we want to understand to manage and treat better. Unfortunately, there's no cure. So that was the work of 2 honor students in School of Medicine, where we worked together. So we look at calcium isotopes, so this time not in teeth, but in urine and blood. So we work with a cohort of patients. We did a clinical study, and we were looking for a relationship between calcium isotope, calcium concentration, and the usual markers of kidney function. What we found is that there wasn't really any relationship, so it's quite flat here, between eGFR, which is a marker for kidney function, and calcium isotope in urine. Urine calcium concentration, you get more of a relationship decrease, so an inverse relationship with eGFR. What is interesting with calcium isotope in urine is that you see clear differences between male and females in the control group, so people who don't have kidney disease, which makes sense because calcium isotope will respond to your calcium budget in the body. Where is that? In the bones. And we know that bone-wise, men and women have very different physiology on many other aspects too, of course. Whereas in people, HD is hemodialysis. So people with kidney disease on dialysis, this variation, this difference seems to disappear, and probably linked to the change in kidney function that is messing up your calcium physiology. what we do find is calcium concentration. So just measuring calcium concentration in urine, and I can't give you the threshold here because we're trying to commercialize this, is very good at predicting if someone has the disease, 98%. And it also have a good specificity. So specificity means that how good it is to tell that someone who don't have the disease, don't have the disease. Because sometimes you're going to do a diagnosis and you don't have the disease, but the test is saying, oh yeah, you're positive. Well, you're not. So that's what specificity is testing. Also very performant at ruling out this false negative. Then looking in blood, so looking at calcium isotope in blood, this time calcium isotope in blood is telling us, yes, there's a good relationship with markers of kidney function. One interesting results too, when we look at transplants, so people who had kidney disease and who received a kidney transplant, they seem, when you look at the calcium isotope composition of their blood, they similar to the control. So people who are healthy, it's not as bad. You see the people on dialysis, they have a much higher calcium isotope composition. So it's going down, just not quite as far back down, but you can actually evaluate the performance, if you like, of the transplant by your return to semi-normal kidney function. And here too, so this time the calcium isotope in blood, we're able to show that it's very performant at identifying who has kidney disease and also who hasn't, and making sure that those who don't are not identified as having it. And even better for identifying severe, so late stage kidney disease. So here we got potentially a two-step diagnostic screening tool for kidney disease, where we just take a urine sample. So you can go to your chemist, get a vial, pin the vial, send it to the lab. We measure calcium concentration. We tell you, this is not looking great. Then you can go to a GP, get a blood sample, look at calcium isotope ratio, and then validate whether or not this is actually looking like you might have chronic kidney disease. And we can take that further. So we're working with people in exercise science. So this form of exercise therapy that can help you manage better. Again, there's no cure, unfortunately, but that can help you manage better and live better with the disease. And that potentially we could use calcium isotope to look at that because what the other thing that we found is that that could be a useful tool to look at vascular calcification. So when you start having calcium deposit in your veins, because the big thing with this is that actually cardiovascular disease are the first cause of mortality in patients with kidney disease. They don't die from the loss of kidney function, they die from a heart attack. And some results that I'm not showing here show us that calcium isotope in blood are very good at detecting that. So hopefully we can also help identify those people who are more at risk. So yeah, Mr. Bean is pretty happy with that, and me too. All right, so I'll just finish up and I'll be quick and hopefully I won't be too antagonizing, but I think it's a friendly crowd here. Just going back to that homemade meme from the ad and from the first slide, and what some people, at least in Australia, think what geoscience is, and mostly the resource industry, and what geoscience really is. And that's a poster from the Geological Society in the UK that shows the diversity of what geoscience is and how that addresses the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we really need, and we have, for those in academia in Australia, and I've heard stories from people the last couple of days, it's just disheartening what's happening in academia in the geoscience community. And unfortunately, talking about this sort of thing might be too late, but still we need to move forward in the future. We need to walk away from this idea that geoscience education is just a conduit that feeds into the resource industry. Because let's be honest, this is what we're mostly doing. But if we keep doing that, unfortunately, what we start to see is that a lot of students, and the GSA had a talk last year about that, talking about geoscience education, we came to that realization that a lot of students are walking away from our field. Because yes, a job in mining is good, it's well paid, but they look through the window and they see the world is burning and they have some mixed thoughts. So the mining industry is not so much at Guild, but working in the oil industry, they have a conscience and they're not too comfortable anymore working in an industry that contributes to create the world out there that we're having right now. The GSA has a leadership role to play in federating all these fields of geoscience. All of them that you can't read right now on the slide, but you got geomorphology, volcanology, of course, geophysics, environmental geochemistry, erosion, coastal erosion, which affects, Australia's a big island, so that's sensitive to that, and so on, hydrogeology, engineering geology, and so on. All this is geoscience. We just need to embrace that. It's out there. We just need to bring this community together. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we're going to keep losing students. Unfortunately, more departments will close down. I don't know what's going to happen to mine. I guess I'll know next month. We lose students. We don't, even for the resource industry, that's important, because if we're not there to supply this graduate, what are they going to do? Actually, you know what they're going to do? I was at a meeting with the Australian Geoscience Council on Tuesday. There was someone from industry. We were talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we talk also about this problem in academia right now. And the guy said, we'll just get the graduate from overseas. So this loyalty we have to the resource industry, we need mining, absolutely, that keyboard in front of me, these monitors, they didn't just appear like that. That's thanks to mining. We absolutely need the resource industry, but geoscience in Australia needs to diversify its portfolio. It's a little bit like in finance, if you just invested in Bitcoin, well, first you should invest in Bitcoin. But if you invest in one thing, you need to have a portfolio. And we haven't done that so far. You got hydrogeology, geomorphology, soil science, environmental science, quaternary science. All that is needed to rescue geoscience education in Australia. So yes, the GSA have specialist group that cover some of this. But if you look, and I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot, but I just look at the emails I get, and they're great, and I really enjoyed seeing this seminar announcement. But look at them. They almost, of course, economic geology specialist group, but they very much focus on high temperature geology and ore deposits. Again, very important topics, but and I work with some of these people, but it's not just that. We should hear also, in my opinion, about groundwater resource, river dynamics, soil carbon storage, water quality, response to bushfire. All that is geoscience, coastal erosion. And we can only do that if we bring these communities into geoscience, into the GSA. I'm not asking the GSA to do a takeover on other professional societies, but we need these links. Another thing I'll finish with, and then I'm really starting to get antagonizing. The GSA needs to follow in the footsteps of other geological society. I'm not saying, be controversial. Other geological society, very respected in the US and the UK, And I'm sure in other countries have done that ages ago. And acknowledge, and I understand there's been an attempt of doing that in the GSA. And I understand why there's some caution about doing that. But we need to have that statement to acknowledge human-induced global warming and the need for action. In the UK, they've done that in 2015, 6 years late. In the US, they've done that in 2006, with 15 years late. Even the Australian Academy of Science, they have a little bit of a lukewarm statement, but they've done that in 2015. So I think it's time. I know some of us already had that discussion, and I just think we really need to drive this forward. So yeah, that's all. Thanks for surviving through this talk. Will probably took forever. Thanks very much.